Well, another day, another Zelda game. If I keep this up, I should be all cut up by the time Breath of the Wild 2 comes out. The Minish Cap is the finale of what fans call the Four Swords trilogy. Although it's actually the first game to take place in the timeline, being the second game in the main timeline. Yeah, the Zelda timeline gets a little confusing, especially considering they won't say where Breath of the Wild takes place, but that's another topic. So let's get started with the final game in the Four Sword trilogy before we get to the big one, Twilight Princess. Like all Zeldas, we open with a narration. The world was being swallowed by shadow, but the tiny Picori appearing from the sky bringing a sword of light. With wisdom and courage, the hero drove out the darkness. The blade was enshrined with care. Thus we open to the present day as Princess Zelda heads to the blacksmith's house where his grandson Link is asleep. Once again, continuing the tradition that Link can have any other relatives but parents. It's the Picori Festival. Reminds me of the opening of the Chrono Trigger. That review was a long time away. As always, Zelda opens with our hero being woken up. Link is missing his iconic cap in this game. There's a reason for that. So Link and Zelda meet and the two decide to go to the Picori Festival together. The blacksmith also gives you the smith's sword. Like always, this is how the game will give Link a reason to carry his sword. Next up, the game forces you to check out the Picori Festival. It mostly gives characterization to Zelda. Basically, the festival is a way to get you used to the controls of the game. We've gone back to a more traditional top-down Zelda, and I love top-down Zelda. Zelda is characterized interestingly here. Like, why would you pick a small shield over all the other choices? Of course, the answer to that is so that Link will have a shield to protect her. Since this is a Game Boy Advance game, we've gone back to mapping the shield to either the A or B button. To compensate for this, the R button has been mapped to the roll button. The obligatory way to move faster in a Zelda game until the stamina meter came into play. So Link and Zelda arrive at the palace, just in time for the ceremony because, as soon as that happens, something bad is going to happen. Such is the way with storytelling. Of course, it would be at that moment that Vati would show up. He looks quite different. This game actually explains his backstory. Long overdue in my opinion. He has motivations this time. He wants to find the Light Force, which I suppose is not related to the Triforce, but is its own thing. Vati is much more popular in this form because of fangirls. Yeah, let's just go with that. Vati shatters the Picori sword, thus setting all the evil spirits free, but Link and Zelda protect themselves. Obviously a little hint that Zelda has something. Well, ain't that always the way. Once again, the plot is to rescue Zelda, which is, to be fair, the bare minimum for a Zelda game. Link wakes up in a bed and meets with the King of Hyrule, because that tradition of Zelda only ever being allowed to have a father continues. Link never has parents, Zelda never has a mother. The king gives Link the broken Picori blade to reforge, so this is technically the second plot MacGuffin sword in the Zelda timeline, with the Master Sword being the first. So Link heads to the Minish Woods. The world of the Minish Cap is compact, but yet expansive at the same time. Once again, rolling is the ideal way to get moving to where you want to go. The Minish Woods reminds me of the Lost Woods, which is probably the intention. I know I shouldn't expect continuity in these games intentionally, but I'd like to point it out. While in the woods, Link comes across a hat that's being attacked. His name is Ezlo. Ezlo reminds me of Enzo from Reboot. Ezlo serves as Link's hat for the game, but he also serves another purpose. Every time Link gets on a stump, Ezlo can shrink Link down to the size of the Minish. This is the main gimmick of the Minish Cap, shrinking. It's a good gimmick, one that opens up new level designs. Also, heart pieces in this game just lay out in the open for you to find, no challenge to them. There's some, but we'll get into one in particular. Oh, believe me, we'll get to it. So, the Minish village shows us the Minish, one of the more interesting races in the Zelda canon. They live up to their name. Like all races, they speak their own language, so Link has to eat a Jabber nut to be able to understand them. I know what I said. The purpose of this section here is to find out your goal, which is to get the 4 elements and get your way to the first dungeon of the game, the Deep Wood Shrine, which is not far from Minish Woods. The Deep Wood Shrine is your standard opening dungeon designed to get you used to the mechanics of the game. New mechanic, pulling levers all the way out and pulling mushrooms to get across gaps. This game takes advantage of being on the Game Boy Advance, such as the barrel that moves depending on where you stand. This Zelda game actually has heart pieces in the dungeon, which is something Twilight Princess would repeat in the next game. The mini-boss is a giant caterpillar. Reminds me of Wiggler from the Mario games. Probably intentional considering how the two series like to borrow from each other. The item is the Gust Jar, which allows Link to suck up any cobwebs or drain the life from those mushrooms. I like this item as it allows for a versatile extension of Link's abilities, and that's what items should do. Oh, and you can also get mysterious shells, and believe me, I have some words I want to say about these things. The Gust Jar is also used for going across these lily pads, which can be a bit tedious because you have to do this repeatedly throughout the game. The boss of the dungeon is a regular green Clue, but because Link is so small, the thing appears as a giant. That's actually kind of clever. The trick is to use the Gust Jar to drain its feet so it'll topple over. It's a clever take on a common enemy. Hey, those elements look like the jewels you got in Four Swords Adventures from the Knights, which makes sense actually. Continuity! Next stop is Mount Krenel, where Link must meet Malari. Of course, go here, go there, what do you take me for? You're errand boy! Taking some time to explore Hyrule, you find the usual assortment of goodies, which is what the world of Zelda should have. The game's made side quest gimmick is fusing kinstones. Everybody has different kinstones, green, red, and blue. Some are common, some not so much. When you have the appropriate set, something interesting will happen, and it's actually kind of addictive. Part of the fun is not knowing what you will get. Hyrule Town is basically your safe haven from all the monsters. You can learn new sword attacks as you go throughout the game, like in Zelda 2. They all range in various levels of usefulness. Why do I have to learn the spin attack? A standard Zelda ability is beyond my understanding. Mount Krenel is like Death Mountain. It's filled with Tektites. Not spiders, Tektites. And boulders that come crashing down. The main gimmick is using Ezlo to hover around with the whirlwinds. You can also get the grip ring, which allows Link to climb up specific mountain areas, so I guess Breath of the Wild kinda adapted the idea from this game. So eventually Link arrives at the top of the mountain and meets Malari, who gets to work on reforging the Picori sword, leaving you to go to the second dungeon, the Cave of Flames. This dungeon has bombs that will move as soon as you hit them. Can't rely on them to do anything, so just stick to your regular bombs. I love taking the minecarts. Just a lot of fun. This dungeon also requires you to switch between large and small Link. Remember, the first dungeon you had to spend the entire dungeon small. This is the first dungeon to use that mechanic. The mini-boss is a bunch of spiked Clues, which isn't really original in my opinion. Could have come up with something better. You get the cane Apache after this. How do you pronounce that? Which gives you the power to flip things over. That's mundane. It comes in handy for the dungeon and later in the game, but it also serves a secondary purpose in that it allows Link to leap the high heights from a hole in the ground. The cane Apache does allow you to flip these lava blocks with spikes on them, but you have to be quick or you'll take a dive. One of the more annoying parts of the dungeon. The boss of the dungeon, Glee Rock, is actually a pretty easy boss fight since it involves using the cane Apache to flip over its shell and then slashing the coral on the back. Do it enough times and the fire element will be yours. So you go back to the mine and the Picori sword has been repaired. It is now the white sword. I guess that's appropriate. So you take the white sword to the Elemental Sanctuary, which is in Hyrule Castle. Well, that's lucky. Inside, Link infuses 2 of the elements into the sword. This gives you the ability to make a copy of yourself, obviously hinting what this sword is going to become. But as you exit, Link encounters Vaati. It's a good scene. It gives Vaati some much needed characterization, as well as providing some backstory between Ezlo and Vaati. You see, Vaati was Ezlo's apprentice, but Vaati was corrupted by power and thus turned Ezlo into a hat. So now you have to break the curse on both Zelda and Ezlo. Also, this chronologically is the first game to have moblins, even though Ganon doesn't exist yet. Huh. This game is definitely doing a better job of fleshing Violet out, because, let's face it, he didn't have much characterization in his first two games. Violet decides to do the smart thing and realizing that Link will bring the elements to him, decides to impersonate the king and look for the light force. You'd think the soldiers would know their king was acting out of character, but I guess they're not very smart. What's annoying about the copies is that the slightest thing out of order, they will disappear. I never found it too distracting, but it can inhibit things. In order to access to the next dungeon, you need the Pegasus boots. The maker is asleep, so Link must go play fetch quest. Again, typical video game thing. But once you do that, you get the Pegasus boots, which again must be equipped to use. I guess the Link's Awakening Switch remake spoiled me to the idea of having these equipped at all times. Along the way, you run into Long Long Ranch, where you meet Talon and Malon again. I love seeing these two. Brings back memories of Ocarina of Time. I will say one thing about the Minish Cap. It really takes advantage of its ability to shrink down and see the world from the Minish's perspective. It makes for amazing scenery, especially for the Game Boy Advance. I love exploring the town with this ability and finding new things. Fusing kinstones is oddly addictive. It's a nice idea to form a connection with the people in the Zelda world. But that leads me to the figurine collecting. Oh boy, is this annoying. It's like the Nintendo Gallery from Wind Waker, except even worse, because it's totally random as to whether or not you get a new figurine depending on how many shells you give. The more you get, the less likely your chances become. I'll get more into this at the end, when getting all of them became a real grind. Also, why was destroying your pots with your sword an upgrade? This game has dark nuts. Fighting them in a top-down Zelda is definitely different than fighting them in a 3D plane. You have to dodge their attacks and then strike their side. That takes us to the Castor Woods, the swamp area of the Minish Cap. The Pegasus boots will keep Link from sinking. This area is a puzzle since you have to get 3 gold kinstones. These kinstones are actually required to get. Yep, then you gotta stop that statue from activating. All said and good. It makes for good use of the shrinking ability. Finally, we enter the Fortress of Winds. This fortress is much more puzzle-driven, such as having to use the holes in the floor to your advantage. The dungeon puts good use to all the skills that Link has accumulated throughout the adventure so far, which is what the midpoint dungeon should do. The mini-boss is another dark nut, so the strategy is much the same. White dark nuts are not that strong, it's the ones with the capes you have to look out for. The item you get here is the mole mitts, which allow Link to dig through dirt, and it comes in handy throughout this adventure as it really opens up secrets for you to find. The only part I find annoying is when you have to activate certain switches using the duplicate ability. Just an annoying part. Well, let's get to the boss, and I really like the boss. Reminds me of the boss in the Tower of the Gods in Wind Waker, which was probably the intention. Its name is Mazel. You have to use the bow and arrow to damage its hands, and then shrink down to go inside the head. I like that this boss makes good use of both small and big Link. Do it 3 times and the boss will go down. But when you go to get the element, you find that it's missing. Great, nothing says pain than knowing you went through a dungeon for no reward. But then again, you do get the Ocarina, which allows Link to warp anywhere he wants. Yeah, every Zelda game has had a warping feature, and it's always welcomed. Well, mostly every Zelda game. Also, there's this guy that's afflicted with a ghost, and you have to save him. It's definitely an interesting choice, but it's one that gives the world variety. If you don't do this, well, let's just say you missed your chance. Then comes the part where Link has to return overdue books to the library so he can create a passage to where he needs to go to get the flippers so he can swim underwater. What am I, an errand boy? Minish Cap definitely likes to give you time to explore the world and thus get sucked into it. It's something I can appreciate. But then, there's the Cuckoo chasing minigame, and oh lord, I hate this game. Link must move as fast as humanly possible, which isn't easy, mind you. You just gotta get a certain amount of cuckoos in a set amount of seconds. The gold ones give you more money, but you have to let them go so they don't fly out of your grip. All this to get a piece of heart. One of the more annoying heart pieces in Zelda history. Well, let's go to the 4th dungeon, the Temple of Droplets. Well, first impressions, ice physics are back. How wonderful. It's an ominous dungeon that really makes you think. You're heading towards the end, what with that music. Pushing a block with a key wall on ice is annoying. Stupid ice physics. The main gimmick of the dungeon is having to fall the huge block. I like when there's something that you're working towards in the dungeon. Makes the progression feel natural. Then there's pushing a lily pad to get across the water. Typical. The mini-boss is a giant blue cuckoo. The strategy is much the same as before, except this time you have to look out for electricity. The item is the Flame Lantern? Oh goody, a standard starting Zelda item is a dungeon item. That's just great. So you finally fall out the element, but a big Octorok takes it. Oh joy. The big Octorok is one of the more annoying bosses in the game since the strategy keeps changing. The goal is to hit the flower tip with the lantern while it's vulnerable, but getting around while on ice is no easy task. This boss just really pushed me to my limit. I got down to a smidge of health, but I managed to pull through. Thank the video game gods. So now I have the water element. 3 elements down. You then meet a ghost of a former king of Hyrule. So we have to go to the graveyard after we infuse the element. Because the king has the castle on lockdown, that means you have to sneak into the castle. Does anybody not realize that something's up? So now I can create 2 additional copies of Link. Almost there! The graveyard is a maze, which is just typical. Every Zelda game has to have something like this. Losing the key, getting the key back, it's also mind-numbing. So you make it inside the royal crypt. Gyptos can be burned. That's good and makes sense. You gotta put the 3 copies to the test with an annoying spike that bothers you. So finally you make it to the tomb and the deceased King Gustav gives you a kinstone. Good to know, buddy. The Cloud Tops is appropriately named. It's another puzzle area. Finding all the right kinstone pieces to unlock the way to the Palace of Winds. You also get remote bombs, so Breath of the Wild was not the first game to do that. I love remote bombs. So finally you access the Palace of the Winds, and this has got to be one of the best dungeons in Zelda ever. It makes use of every single ability Link has. The scenery is just amazing. The dungeon is long, but I don't really care. It's everything a Zelda dungeon should be. Action-packed, filled with puzzles, and makes good use of all the items and skills you've accumulated until now. Making use of the magical boomerang which can fly in any direction, I love everything about this dungeon. When you get to the Rocks Cave, that's when the level really opens up, as Link can now jump and flip through panels. The mini-boss is a red Dark Nut, but with the Rocks Cave you can now flip over them. Really adds to the combat of the game. The boss, George Pair, is actually really exhilarating because it takes place while you're in the air. You have to make your way through the blue smaller one and the red big one. Once again it came down to the very end. A smidge of health, but I managed to pull it off. That's always the best feeling. So finally, at long last, the final element is yours. Despite empowering your sword with them, they really don't give your sword elemental powers. Just kinda odd, really. But before I went to the final dungeon, I had some shells to collect. Basically, you want to get all the shells you can to get the remaining figurines. And I spent a few hours just grinding for this. Go to the grass area, use the spin attack, and keep doing that until you finally get all the figurines. What's worse is that after you beat the game, there's 6 more you can get. Yeah, this Zelda actually has post-game content, like the Mirror Shield. It's basically your 100% award that I wonder why they even bothered with it. Well, let's get back on track. It's time to go to the final dungeon, Dark Hyrule Castle. Man, Hyrule Castle is used as the final dungeon of Zelda games a lot, isn't it? So finally you sneak in and the final element is infused into the sword. It gives you a projectile attack, which is nice. It also opens a path to where you find some murals. It gives you more of the backstory of the Picori, but... oh. But that just gave Viati what he wanted. Viati knocks Link out, and then proceeds to begin heading to drain Zelda of her life force. Of course, why Viati didn't just kill Link is beyond my understanding. Bond villain stupidity at its finest. With his new power, Link can now free those turned to stone. Dark Hyrule Castle definitely carries the tone of, this is the final dungeon. You find the king turned to stone and finally return him to normal. He gives you a way to get out of the castle, and we're going to be needing that, because we have some final heart pieces to get. Yeah, take a detour to get the final heart pieces of the game. So finally back in Dark Hyrule Castle. This part where you have to deflect the cannonballs back at the statues is so annoying to time. the most annoying part of the whole dungeon. And then you have to fight several Dark Nuts! As you get closer to the top, the bell starts to ring. Once it rings 3 times, the spell will be cast and Zelda will die. The first 2 rings are automatic, but the third one will happen if you waste too much time fighting 3 Dark Nuts. My hands began to sweat as I was doing the last battle. Fortunately, jumping above them and slamming into the ground will make short work of them. I don't know how much of it is timed. The Black Knight is the toughest Dark Knight of them all. Fortunately, Link manages to arrive just in time to stop Viety from draining Zelda. Viety doesn't take his plans being ruined well, and finally it's time to confront the main villain. His first form is pretty easy as you just have to damage him in the eye, obvious foreshadowing to what he will become. This form requires you to use 4 copies of yourself to your advantage as you have to match the formation with the real eyes after you flip them over. Of course, the clones are vulnerable to anything, so you really have to be cautious. But the final battle is really fun, actually. It tests your skills to the limit. With that done, Link rescues Zelda at last. But of course, the dungeon is collapsing, so Link and Zelda must escape. Reminds me of Ocarina of Time. But before the duo can escape, Vaati makes one last attempt to destroy Link. Finally taking the form we know him to have, I wish Zelda had a role to play in this fight. Would have made up for spending most of the game as a statue. It makes good use of small Link since you have to destroy Vaati's tentacles. I like that this puts all of Link's abilities to the test. It's what a final boss should do, be a culmination of everything you learn throughout the game. Eventually you wear him down and deliver the final blow. But the cost was too high. With Vaati defeated, Ezlo returns to his original form. Ezlo instructs Zelda to put on the Mage's Cap to restore peace to Hyrule. It's like a Dragon Ball wish, a Deus Ex Machina reset button. So with that, it's time for the Minish to return to their world and Ezlo and Link must say goodbye. But not before Ezlo gives Link one final gift. Ah, the origin of the hat. Until Skyward Sword had him with the hat already, so yeah, somebody screwed up. So that's The Legend of Zelda the Minish Cap. It's actually the best of the Four Swords trilogy by far because it's actually a traditional Zelda. The dungeons are fun, the game's gimmick is creative, the soundtrack isn't particularly memorable, but it's there, and I love the art style, it really meshes well with the game. If I were to rank this one, it would probably be in the 10 to 15 range since whenever the Breath of the Wild 2 comes out, we'll have 20 Zelda games. It's definitely above Four Sword and Four Sword Adventures. I recommend The Legend of Zelda the Minish Cap. Thanks for watching. If you like this video, please hit that bell, like, and subscribe button. If you want to keep up to date, follow me on Twitter or join my Discord, which are provided in the description below. See you next time.